Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle, for those kind words, and thank all of you for being here. I'd like to thank everyone at the Advocates for Human Rights for this honor. It's been incredibly humbling to be here and to learn about the work that you all do and the work that the Fraser family has been doing. It's really a tremendous honor to receive this award. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Robin Phillips for organizing such a great visit and for your hospitality. I had heard that Minnesotans were cold and unfriendly, but that's not true. You guys are nice. I'd also like to give thanks to the Dakota, Sioux, and Ojibwe tribes on whose land we feast and celebrate. It's really impossible to be surrounded by all this beauty at this bend of the Mississippi River and not think about the generations that lived here before. And then, of course, just down the road at Fort Snelling, Native people were incarcerated in mass and summarily executed. These crimes weren't so long ago and should always be a reminder that human rights abuses start at home. And then one thing I learned just recently about the depot, and you guys might have already known this, is that this was a part of the orphan train where children were brought here and then auctioned off for their labor. So while you're seeing the trailer to the film I did about forced labor of children on egg farms in Ohio now, that's clearly part of the history of the Midwest. The genocide of the Native people and the enslavements of the Africans, that's as fundamental to this country, the founding of it, as the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. This country's legacy of contradictions is as inescapable as our own DNA. And at times, the atrocities that define our history feel more powerful than our professed ideals, especially today when political discourse has crumbled, hate crimes are rising, and inequality is at a historic high. Fortunately, there are plenty of sources of inspirations in times like this, because our current turmoil is nothing new. I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my heroes, who was a woman named Ida B. Wells. She was born into slavery in 1862, which was the same year as the executions down the road. She was a black woman in the Reconstruction-era South, and she became a self-taught journalist, documenting every instance of lynching as it was happening, creating an irrefutable record of the terror of extrajudicial murders that had become spectacles for the mobs. Imagine, she was a single black woman. She was receiving death threats. She even had the printing press at her independent newspaper destroyed. Yet she continued to publish, never wavering from her mission, always maintaining the higher ground, appealing to reason and morality. She was a firm believer in human rights and famously wrote, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." In the middle of the crisis all around her, with death and terror all around, she pressed on. Now, I've been fortunate not to live with that type of persecution that she felt in her own country, doing her job. But as my eyes have been open to the ongoing trauma experienced by so many in our communities, I look towards her courage to maintain my resolve. As many of you who do this work, you take on a lot of the trauma of the people that you're working with. You have to, on some level, to be able to experience the empathy that's needed to do this work. Now, when I became a journalist, it was because of an irresistible curiosity I had and a desire to wander the globe, talking to people, learning about their lives. And though I've reported from Latin America, Asia, and Europe, over the last decade, I focused on stories here in the US that have remained hidden, unspoken, and even taboo. I've made the decision to use my privilege as an educated, English-speaking, American cis man to elevate stories of those who have been oppressed by the darker sides of our society. I've been fortunate to work with organizations and colleagues, mostly women and people of color. And frankly, I'm standing up here and getting this award, but basically every film that has been recognized and all these awards have been done by teams, Nobody does any of this work by themselves. It takes the collective efforts and minds and intelligence and resolve to be able to do this work together. So as I'm standing up here, I'm representing a lot of people. So together we produced a series of films, radio pieces, articles about sexual assault against immigrant women in the agricultural and janitorial industries. It took time, resources, compassion, cultural competence. We were able to build trust with people who otherwise had no reason, no incentive to talk to us. One of the things I tell people is when we go out looking for someone to appear on camera, if we're going out there and we're trying to convince them to be in our piece, that we're doing a disservice. A lot of the times when people come with these stories, they have undergone a trauma which they're carrying inside their body, which needs time to resolve. And if you touch that nerve too soon, you can be doing damage to that person. So what we did was we patiently combed throughout the country looking for the people who were ready to tell their story because they felt empowered that their story was going to be able to help others. Of course, this is very challenging work for many reasons. One of them is the extreme power imbalance between the reporter and the sources. Just to give you an example, a lot of the farm workers that we were talking to, a lot of them had third-grade educations, may have grown up without electricity or plumbing, and in many cases were people who came from indigenous communities in which Spanish was their second language. And here we were coming in, asking them to tell their story to an American audience that would be on the television, it would be on the internet. There's a lot of care that has to be taken to make sure that people are giving informed consent and they know what they're agreeing to. It was through that process of trying to explain what a journalist does that I realized that most Americans probably don't understand what journalists do either. And it's getting more complicated every day. So let me try to explain. My job as a journalist is to go out into the world, gather information, synthesize it, present it clearly to the public so that we can collectively make informed decisions to better society. I'm going to say that again. We gather facts, present them to the public so that we may collectively make informed decisions to have a better society. That's what we're trying to do. It's a simple proposition. It's considered a foundation of a democracy. It's referred to as the fourth estate and can be summed up in the phrase freedom of speech. But there are times when the First Amendment feels inadequate, when the messenger is branded an enemy and the message is fake. It's easy to lose hope, especially when we seem to stumble from crisis to crisis, whether it's gun violence, mass incarceration, sexual assault, or trafficking. The light of truth that Ida B. Wells spoke about can begin to feel like a candle in the wind. But history is cyclical, and these crises are predictable, and so should our response. We should always be rising to the challenge, and for inspiration, we need new heroes. As it turns out, some of my heroes are lawyers. Going back to Chile, as was mentioned before with the film, when Augusto Pinochet took power in a military coup, he began an era of brutal repression. Young people, the age of millennials today, were dragged from their homes, violently tortured, and disappeared. While I was researching this, I had a very disorienting experience. I was going through the testimonies of the descriptions of the torture. Some of the survivors had actually drawn pictures of what had happened to them. And this was during the Iraq War when I was doing this. And the news of Abu Ghraib came out. And you started to see photos of the abuses American soldiers how they were abusing Iraqi prisoners. And it was unmistakable. Some of the same things that were being done to the prisoners in Abu Ghraib were what the Chileans had been describing happened to them, the same torture positions. And in fact, when I did some research, the Chilean Secret Service had learned it from the Brazilians, who had learned it from the French, who had been using it in Algeria, And some of these same positions have been used all the way going back to the Spanish Inquisition. I bring this up just to say that this is nothing new. These are things that are happening all the time, all around the world. Not just here, not just Latin America. It's a constant in that we need to be always vigilant about how to deal with this. So while these horrors were unfolding in Chile, in the middle of the crisis, lawyers like a woman named Carmen Hertz began frantically filing habeas corpus petitions, demanding that the courts account for the whereabouts of sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers. All the petitions were denied, and the dictatorship just steamrolled ahead. Journalists began interviewing witnesses, publishing articles and books, but the government published their own misinformation, and Pinochet remained in power for 17 years with impunity. Nonetheless, in the middle of the crisis, the lawyers and journalists continued to do their work. These are my heroes. But on one hand, they weren't doing anything extraordinary. They were simply doing their jobs. But against the backdrop of fascism, the act of telling stories and upholding human rights becomes a revolutionary act. In addition to providing an example of how to deal with reporting and lawyering during a hostile regime, it also taught me a valuable lesson. It made me realize the shared mission that journalists and lawyers often have. To be completely frank, lawyers and journalists don't always get along. Lawyers have as their primary duty to advocate for the interests of their clients, whereas journalists we are devoted to not to a person, but to the public. Our need to share the story widely can conflict with the individual concerns of specific people. So ongoing cases, attorney-client privilege, sealed documents, they can all be frustrating to journalists who are trying to get to a story. But there are many similarities between our work. We're both investigators. We both gather facts. We are both interested in personal stories and larger systemic trends. The attorney-client privilege is analogous to the confidentiality agreements that we make with our sources. We're both looking for the truth and ultimately trying to better society. So much of our mission is the same, and I wouldn't have been able to do my work without lawyers who understood what we both had to gain by working together. So this is not my first time in Minnesota. I was here about 5 years ago when I was working on the film Rape on the Night Shift. I ended up here because of a series of extraordinary events. One of them primarily involved a woman named Leticia Zuniga, who was a janitor and had been sexually assaulted repeatedly by her supervisor while working at the Ridgedale Mall in Minnetonka. While the kind of abuse that she was suffering is not uncommon, her courage to tell her story was incredibly, what do you even say when somebody has the courage to do that? You can't say that's uncommon. What word would you use? It's valiant, it's courageous, it's incredible. It's something that I stand in awe of when you meet somebody who's willing to put their own personal shame, their own reputation on the line to be able to help somebody else in the future. That's what it is. That's what we're up against when you meet somebody like Leticia. So knowing that she was going to share this story with us was enough for us to get on a plane and come out here with a film crew to interview her, without a doubt. We wouldn't hesitate to do that. But that wasn't the only thing that made this a one-of-a-kind case. Lisa Stratton, who was working at Gender Justice and representing Leticia, had made a calculated decision during the settlement hearings and insisted that some of the documents that they had received during discovery remained unsealed. Those documents became available to us, and this action, in which we got access to all the internal sexual harassment complaints that the company had received and showed how they investigated and responded to these complaints, or more accurately, how they didn't, allowed us to show that Leticia's situation was not unique, that there was a corporate culture of indifference, and it validated the stories that we've been hearing from countless women, that their claims of abuse, their pain and suffering, were not being taken seriously. Lisa's foresight was instrumental in allowing us to tell this story in a more profound way. Yeah. Thank you. This film ended up inspiring more women janitors to speak up. And like Rape in the Fields before, it led to legislation in California which provides more protections for women in the fields and cleaning at night. But that type of impact is very unusual, or at least is rarely so obvious. Most of the work we do, we never see what ends up happening to it. You write an article, you make a film, it goes out into the world, and it seems like nothing's changing. In this case, the janitorial women organizers literally used the title of our film in their campaign, putting up billboards calling for end on the rape on the night shift. Whereas others like Ida B. Wells saw no such impact during her lifetime. 2 decades after her passing, Emmett Till was lynched without recourse. But this didn't mean that her work didn't matter. It contributed to a body of knowledge that fueled national outrage and would ultimately lead to the change. Likewise, the habeas corpus petitions in Chile did not stop the disappearances. But 30 years later, those documents were used in human rights cases against Pinochet. Ultimately, he was indicted on several counts and died under house arrest. And it meant the work that they were doing at the time of the crisis would ultimately lead to a form of justice decades later. And it's something that continues to inspire me to think about what impact we might have on the future, even if we don't see that impact now. This is all a perfect example of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. meant when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And while I believe this to be true, I also know that it doesn't happen by accident. It takes perseverance, courage, and cooperation. I've reached a stage in my career when I can pick which stories to tell, and there are no shortage of critical issues to address. I've always wanted to continue my climate change reporting because it became politicized in this country at a time where there was a lot of discussion of, is there climate change? Is there not climate change? And because of that, we got stunted in our knowledge of it, and there's a basic fundamental misunderstanding about what's at stake. And we're not aware of the crisis that's unfolding around us. And make no mistake, it will be one of the primary causes of human rights abuses for the next generation, as water scarcity, flooding, and famine continue to displace people by the millions. So while that storm looms, I've chosen to continue focusing on the crisis, another crisis right in front of our face. Now, Fort Snelling was by no means the only site to detain and massacre Native peoples. There were many others. Another one was Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It was instrumental in the decimation of the Apache people, and it's where Geronimo spent his final days, and he remains buried there. At the time, the Apache were not U.S. citizens, and though women and children perished there as well, they were all considered enemy combatants. Now, the U.S. government was not above incarcerating U.S. citizens there without cause either. In the 1940s, hundreds of people whose only crime was their Japanese ancestry spent the war years behind barbed wire, deprived of their liberty at Fort Sill. Now, for the 3rd century in a row, Fort Sill is being used again for mass detention. This time, unaccompanied minors from Central America will be housed there by the thousands. A few years ago, many of these children would have been released to family members and other sponsors, or cared for in smaller foster care settings. This administration, however, is moving towards detaining them in larger facilities, on federal land, and exempt from state regulations for child welfare. And in the case of the largest facility in the country, in Homestead, Florida, the center is being run by a for-profit company with ties to a former government official. So, for the immigration and human rights lawyers, and all the journalists, any journalists out there? Hey, what's up? Hey, what's up? This is the time to keep pressing on, reporting and advocating, working to hold the government and the powerful accountable, and inform the public about what is going on today in our country. The other group of heroes, and this was unexpected, was coming here and seeing all of you. I had no idea that this organization was so powerful. I mean, when you really look around, I mean, I have the privilege, again, of standing up here and seeing all of you. It's such an immense feeling of joy and pride to know that there's these issues that have brought us all together to help other people. It's not something that you see a lot. It's not something that we deal with a lot in our day-to-day. But to take the time to pledge our commitment to other human beings is something that gives me personally a lot of energy. And it gives me a tremendous boost so that I can head back into the trenches to do the work. And I can't wait to see you all there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrés, for your powerful message. My name is Ann Lochner. I'm a volunteer for the Advocates and have been for some time. He's right, it's very impressive to be standing out here looking at all of you. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to congratulate again our winners and thank Andrés for his compelling message to all of us. I hope that you will all take a button that you will find in the middle of your table. They're hidden a little bit. I didn't know where they were there, so take some of those. Thank you again for your generosity tonight. We look forward to seeing you at next year's dinner, if not before. Thank you very much for coming. Have a great night.